Hi there, today we're going to make a wooden hanger for Valentine's Day. I bought a 15-inch round at Michael's and I got it on sale when I bought it. But you can get these at lots of different stores and you can get them in any size that you would prefer, but this is the size I wanted for my door. Now, when I'm going to keep this the same color as it is, but I am going to paint black as my base for where my words are going to go. There are a couple of different ways to do it. If you think you're really good at having a steady hand, you can just tape it off. If you want to use kind of a in-between, you can take your stencil and you can kind of place this and then tape it off and use it. Or if you're like me, you can use a method where you cut a 12-inch piece wide, because for me, this works out well for my 15-inch board. Now, of course, if you have a bigger board, it's going to be a little bit different for you. But what you're going to do is you have your centerpiece here that is what's going to be black, and I'm going to weed that out, and then I'm going to just transfer these two pieces, which will make sure that I end up with two perfectly straight lines. So now I'm going to weed out my center piece here. So I'm going to go ahead and weed out the center. And so this is about the area that I will be painting. So we can get rid of this. And now I'm just going to take transfer tape to put over this. Now again, I know that this is going to be using more transfer tape and stencil material than you really need. But if you're somebody like me and you're not comfortable with doing a straight line, this is the way to get around that. So I'm not going to worry that if this fits all the way across perfectly, because I just need to make sure that it gets both sides together. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and remove this, and as you can see, it's going to have the big gap in between, which will create the perfect space for us to paint. Make sure that it stays nice and straight though. So you're going to want to make sure that you place it as straight as you can, because I have my hanger up top, and so I want this to be straight. So once I think I have it about where it is straight, I'm just going to go ahead and make sure this is on really well. I can take off my transfer tape, and I'm going to leave the blue, make sure I leave the blue stencil, of course. Again, you can just use painter's tape instead, because it's definitely cheaper to use painter's tape. But for me, I'm just so bad at placing painter's tape straight, I've learned that this is just a better method for me. Now I'm going to save this transferred paper because it's actually going to be the perfect size for my stencil later. Then what I can do with these blue pieces is I'm going to actually take this and I'm going to just wrap it on the back. That way it's not sticking. Okay, so now I can go ahead and paint my black area, and I know that this is going to be nice and straight lines. Now to paint, I like to use a paper plate because I just find that it's easier for cleanup, and it's easy for me to keep it in the fridge if I need to do a second coat. So I'm just going to put some black paint on here, and I'm just using some basic craft acrylic paint. And I'm going to start with a black base. Again, you can change this to be any color that you like. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and remove the transfer tape now while it's still wet, because it'll just make sure that I get nice, clean lines. Okay, so we're ready for step 2 with our sign, and the next step is going to be to apply our stencil. So the first thing I need to do is to weed it, which I will go ahead and use Editing Magic to speed that up. So for the next step with our sign, we need to weed our stencil. So I'm going to go ahead and use video editing to go ahead and speed that up, but I'm just going to do it really quick. And remember, this is a stencil, so I'm going to be pulling out the actual letters. So the next step after we're finished weeding is we're going to apply our transfer tape. And I'm just using a leftover piece from earlier. We're going to burnish it to make sure that it really adheres to the transfer tape. Next, we need to apply our design. We want to make sure that it is as centered as can be, that the full design is in the black. Then we're going to burnish again to make sure everything comes off our transfer tape. And now that we've done this, I can see that I actually accidentally left my comma, so I'm going to go ahead and weed that out really quick. Now I'm going to go ahead and burnish again to make sure that everything is on there nice and tight. Now I have two suggestions. When you're working with a stencil, if you have a color underneath, I suggest putting the same color back down to make sure this is all sealed, which will give you crisper lines, or to use Mod Podge. If you can see when I did this, I did not Mod Podge my stencil first and I had a little bit seep through. But because this is just a project for me at home, I'm not really worried about this tiny little imperfection. But obviously if you're selling signs, it's going to become imperative that you don't have that. So I'm just going to mix up the paint. And we're going to start first with our coat of black. And then once that dries, we'll actually add our colors. Now, a good tip is once you've done that, you want to make sure that you really go back and forth and up and down on every spot, because you want to make sure again that you've got everything sealed. Now I'm not going to go up and down on here because we're too close to the edge, but you want to make sure that you really get that black in there so that way all of the edges are sealed. Okay, now we're going to let this dry and then we're going to come back with our coats of color. Okay, now that this is fully dry, I'm going to go ahead and add my other paint. Now, I like to use pouncers when I'm working with a stencil because it is less likely to seep through. I'm going to go ahead and do my Hello Sweetheart in all white, and then I'll come back and do my hearts in red. And I'm just going to quickly do this and speed it up so that way you don't have to watch me do the whole thing. And I don't want to rub back and forth, I just want to do an up-down motion. Now when I'm using a pouncer, I like to go back over everywhere to make sure that I kind of get rid of those bubbles. Going back over it also ensures that I got everywhere. Now once I can tell that I've gotten a nice coat on it, I'm actually going to go ahead and take off my transfer tape now. It lessens the amount of black that might possibly get taken off. But again, at the end, I can easily go ahead and take some black and just touch up any spot where I might have had some overage or where the transfer tape picked up the paint. And I accidentally bumped the red heart with my finger, so I'm going to have to go back in and clean that up. So I bumped it with my fingers because this is definitely not something that I do all the time, and I'm not great at removing the stencil. So I'm just going to go in with a paintbrush really quick and touch it up, and then we will let this dry, and then we'll add our bow and our greenery. So this is what our finished sign looks like. Once I was done with the painting and I let it set, I went ahead and used a UV resistant clear acrylic coating spray, and that just protects this from fading. And I just find that it's really helpful because when it's on the door, you know, sometimes your colors can fade, and this will help it from fading. And then on top of it, it does not yellow. So it's a really good, just a top acrylic clear coat to protect this. Now the next step is we're gonna make a bow and put some greenery at the top. So I'm gonna go ahead and move this off to the side. For Valentine's Day, I love to actually go to after Christmas sales and get red ribbon that's from Christmas and use it for Valentine's Day. It's a really great way to save some money on your ribbons, because why can't we use red ribbon for Valentine's Day? And I think I got these for 80% off when I just bought them. So we're going to be making a double layer bow, and we're going to make the bottom one have 3 loops on each side, so I need a total of 6 loops. I'm going to make the tails about 10 inches long, and we're just gonna pinch. And then we're going to make a loop that is 12 inches long. So I'm gonna go down here to the end of my ruler and I'm just gonna pinch, bring my loop back up and continue pinching here in the center. So my tail's hanging down and here's my first loop. So I'm gonna go ahead and do another one. Again, we want it to be about 12 inches long. We're just gonna pinch and gather it on the other side. And then we will keep going. Okay, now that I have my 6 loops, I'm gonna go ahead and make another 10-inch tail. I'd already made this bow and then had to redo it because I got interrupted. So I already pre-cut this about what I thought would be right. And it's a little bit too long, but that's okay because I can cut it after. But again, you wanna cut it to about 10 inches like we did the first one. Okay, now you have a couple of options. You can use a cable tie on this. You can actually just use a chip clip to hold it while you're working on your second layer, but I'm just going to use some wire. Whenever I'm making bows, I just cut a bunch of longer pieces of wire that I can just have sitting next to me so they're ready to work so I don't have to try to cut it while I'm in the middle of making the bow. So we're gonna take the wire, we're gonna go ahead and wrap this, put it onto its back, make sure we pull it nice and tight. Just kind of twist it a couple of times to make sure it holds. So I'm not going to worry about fluffing it or cutting the tails until I do my second layer, but you can kind of see an idea of what our first bottom layer is going to look like. Now for my second ribbon, I'm going to work with one that is thinner. So this was a 2.5 inch ribbon and this one is only 1.5 inches because I like the looks of the smaller ribbon on top of the bigger ribbon. And we're going to be working with only 8-inch tails this time. I'm gonna go just slightly past 8 inches. And then our loops are also only going to be 8 inches. So I'm gonna start it with my tail. I'm gonna go just slightly past 8 inches and then pinch. Then we'll go to 8 inches for our loops and we'll pinch and gather it and hold it. And then go 8 inches again. So I've only done 4 loops this time instead of 6 to make it smaller than my other one. And then I'm going to make my tails, like I said, about 8 inches. This one's a little longer because again, I had already done this ahead of time and I just undid it, but you're gonna just trim to about 8 inches. I'm going to go ahead and put wire on it so I don't lose my bow. Okay, so now I have my bow that only has the 4 loops, and we're going to go ahead and put it on top of our other bow. Now it doesn't really matter what this looks like because we are going to actually be putting a topper that I'll show you here in a second. So I'm just gonna take this and I'm going to attach it to my other bow. Now I want to go ahead and make my little topper piece. That just makes it look nice and neat. So I'm going to go about 7 inches to make sure it's long enough. And I'm going to trim it, and it doesn't matter what it looks like. And then I'm going to just fold it in on itself. And I want a little bit of the red showing on both sides. So we're not going to completely... We just want to fold it in so it meets in the middle. And I am actually going to add a tiny bit of hot glue because I find that it helps it stay better. So I just press down for a second until that sets. Okay, then we're going to take this and we are going to actually wrap it around our bow. It makes it look more finished. Now, I didn't trim my wire from before on purpose, and it's a little bit long so I can attach it to my wreath. But I actually didn't also trim my first one, which is shorter. And I'm going to use the shorter one for my first bow to just kind of wrap around this to hold it tight. And I can trim these if I want, but they're not going to show, so it doesn't really matter. I also like to add a tiny bit of hot glue here underneath. I add it on both sides, and that's just to make sure that this stays. Okay, so this is what our finished bow looks like before fluffing. It's wired ribbon, so now I'm just gonna take each of my loops and fluff them up. And so now you can kind of get an idea of what our finished bow will look like. And I'm not going to trim these until I actually get them onto my wood round and I see about how long I'd like my tails to be. Now I have all sorts of different greenery that I have collected from different things over the years. And so I'm just gonna try some different ones to see what I like for this particular wreath. So if our bow is about up here, I don't want something super heavy because it's already a big bow. We're gonna go with this, a couple of these, because I like the looks of 2 of them. It's just enough. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to staple them on. I have hot glued these on before, and it works really well for the embroidery hoop, but I find that with the wood rounds, because I can just use a staple gun, it helps it stay in so much better. So if I put it here, then this is what my finished product will look like. So I'm just gonna leave this here like this, and I'm gonna grab my staple gun. And I'm going to staple these on. Okay, so now that I've stapled it on, I can go ahead and attach my bow, which you can also staple on the bottom pieces if you want to make them spread out, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to take the wire from the longer pieces that I have left over, and I'm going to loop it through the greenery that was stapled on. Make sure it's nice and tight, and I'm just going to take this and wrap it around a bunch of times. And then I can just trim the wire off. I like to leave a little bit, and I like to actually go back through and make sure I've gotten it nice and secure on this side. Okay, and I'm just going to use my wire cutters, and I'm going to just trim it. So now that I've done this, I think I'm going to put a little bit more greenery. So now that I've done this, I'm just going to add a little bit of extra greenery. So I'm going to just put a piece in here. That, and I'm going to have to lift up to staple. I'm going to add another sprig on the other side, also to make it a little bit fuller. Okay, so when I put my ribbon out, you're not going to see where I stapled it. Okay, so now I'm going to fluff my ribbon, and I'm going to trim my I'm going to do dovetail trim, and I'm going to do this pretty high up because I want to make sure that you can see my sign. So it's just going to kind of go off to the side a little bit, and it is going to block it a little bit, and that's okay. So I'm just going to take this and fold it in half. I'm gonna take my other side and I want it to be about the same length. So we're gonna do the same thing. And then we're going to take our ribbon that goes on top and we're gonna go ahead and do the same thing. And I'm just gonna make it just slightly shorter, but not much. And this is what our finished wreath looks like.